So, good evening, everyone. My name is Maurya Hanspal, and in this session, I would be continuing the session on reading and analyzing the annual report in detail. Okay, so in the previous session, we started our discussion on notes to accounts, and we tried to understand why notes to accounts are so important in analyzing the annual report in detail, and why the notes to accounts are so important. These notes to accounts are so important because they tell you the granular details of each and every item. That whether that is there in your P&L statement or balance sheet or cash flow statement. So to recall, if we go above and we see these annual reports and cash flow statements, you people can clearly see these notes. Like some notes have been mentioned here. Like in front of your like property, plant and machinery, you have note number 5, then note number 6, and note number 7, 8, 12, 24, and so on. So basically the main aim of notes to accounts is to tell you the details in detail, that what exactly comprises of all these things. Okay, so that we tried to understand in the previous session, and we had a detailed understanding of the notes to accounts, and we tried to analyze the some of the notes to accounts as well in the previous session, and we stopped at leases. We also talked about the difference between depreciation, amortization, and impairment, and that is very important, which you people need to know. Okay, so basically we stopped at leases. So what exactly do we mean by leases? You might have heard there are a large number of lease contracts. The leases can be termed as synonymous with like a kind of rental agreements. So what happens in case of lease? Firstly, I'll just write here lease. Yeah, I hope the whiteboard is completely visible to you. So, like, what exactly do we mean by leasing? So, what happens in the practical scenario? A large number of companies or a large number of people who want to like have some work at their places of residence, or they want to have their offices at some places. So, what happens? These places are leased. So, basically, if someone is finding a house to live in, okay, so particularly, I'm talking about a temporary basis. Like if someone is planning to get into a home and planning to get into a home on the basis of a rental basis. Okay. So that contract can be leased. That is, if someone is planning to live in a house and if someone has a job to like stay in different states and does not own a permanent residence, so that person can enter into a lease agreement with the owner. And that owner is called the leaser, lesser or leaser, as whatever you call them. That person is called the leaser, who basically owns the property. Okay, so this property belongs to the leaser, and the person who wants to live in that property after the permission of the leaser or the owner, that person is called the leasee or the lessee, as whatever you call him. So basically, the person who is owning the house, the owner of the house is the leaser, and the person who wants to live in while paying a certain payments, certain contractual payments or rent, as like what you call it in basic sense, like monthly rent, that person is called the leasee. Okay, and the same thing happens in case of the office purposes as well, because an office is being running at a complex or in a very large building. It is not mandatory that the office would be owned by the person like who has taken the office on rent, or the office might be owned by the CEO of the company or the chairman of the company or anyone who is running a particular office at that particular location. In a large number of places, be it your Delhi, be it Gurgaon, Mumbai, Hyderabad, Pune, Goa, a large number of these offices are not owned by the companies in general. The office spaces are being given all lease on lease basis, that is on contractual payments. The company has to pay the owner of that lease or the owner of that buildings or that kind of complexes a certain kind of rent, a monthly rent or an yearly rent is fixed on the basis of this. So that is basically leasing. Further, when we talk about leasing, your leasing can be categorized into two kinds of leasing. Okay, so what can be the two kinds of leasing? Your one kind of leasing is your operating lease, that is your first kind of leasing, and the other kind of leasing is your financial lease. And there is absolute difference between the two. Though the meaning of leasing, it remains same as I what talked about just 1 minute back. But leasing can be further be categorized into two kinds of leases. Your one kind of lease is the operating lease, and the other kind of lease is the financial lease. So what exactly do we mean by operating lease? So what happens in case of the case of operating lease? The ownership does not pass on to lessee, or the ownership does not pass on to that person who is making the contractual payments, either monthly or yearly. It is a short duration contract, and once that period is over, either the person can renew the contract to live in that apartment or flat, or to work into that office for a subsequent period of time, or the person can cancel the contract. So what happens in case of the operating lease? The lessee, or the person who is giving the contractual payments or a rental basis, he can either like renew the contract and keep on living into that apartment or like use that office, or that person can cancel the contract. Okay, so that happens in case of the like when we talk about operating lease. Okay, so the ownership is not passing in. The ownership, it remains with the owner of that apartment or the office or the leaser or the lessor, as like whatever you pronunciate it. Okay, so ideally, like when we talk about the operating lease, the ownership is with the lessor only. Okay, so particularly when we talk about the profit and loss statement or the P&L statement, okay, the person who is the owner of that home or that office, that person would be receiving the kind of rental payments. Okay, and that would be accounted as an income in the P&L statement, because ultimately that lessor or that owner is receiving the payment. Okay, so particularly here, like when we talk from the leaser's point of view or the person who owns the property, so in the statement of P&L, the person would be receiving the income as the rental expenses or the lease or contractual expenses. Also, since the property belongs to that person only, that is, the leaser is having the property or the owner is having the property. So what will happen in this case? The asset would be in the books of accounts of the owner only, right? बैलेंस शीट में जो एसेट होगा, जो भी प्रॉपर्टी प्लांट मशीनरी जो भी होगी, because the property can be taken as lease or plant or machinery also can be taken on lease. So since the ownership belongs to the owner or the lessor who is giving you that asset to use for a subsequent period of time, so the asset would remain on the balance sheet of the owner only. Now, since the asset is in the balance sheet of the owner only, the depreciation would be charged, and now the depreciation would be charged in the P&L account as an expense. So that is the basic thing. And one more thing is left. We are leaving like one more thing. What? Because if the person has given something on rent or on lease, there might be some amount that has to be receivable. Some amount is due and some amount the leaser would get. Again, that amount like would be shown as account receivable, because again that is an asset for the leaser or that is an asset for the owner. I'll repeat the adjustments once again, and the same adjustments are made by the company also. But here in this case, I'm not talking about the company, I'm talking about the owner who has given those property or the plant and machinery on the lease basis. So what will happen? Just imagine I am the owner and I have given the property, plant, machinery on rent or on lease. So I would be having the kind of rental income, and that rental income would be shown in my profit and loss account. Again, that asset is my own asset. I'm owning that asset. So since I have that asset would be shown in the balance sheet in the section of assets. Again, if I am owning that asset, some amount of depreciation would be charged, and now depreciation is your expense, and that would go on to the P&L statement. Again, if I have given something on rent, मैंने किसी को लीज पे कुछ दिया है, there would be some amount that would be recoverable. मुझे उससे अपना लीज कमाना है, मुझे उससे अपना रेंट कमाना है. In case like we can say that a person is a debtor. ठीक है, मुझे सामने वाला person is a debtor and उसको मुझे पैसा and उससे like मुझको पैसा देना है. ठीक है, that person would give me money. So in that case we can call it as an account receivable, right? So ये तो बात होगी ओनर की. अब कंपनी की बुक्स में कैसे बनती हैं एडजस्टमेंट्स? So when we talk about the company, now the company is paying those rentals, company के खर्चों में से जा रहा है, again that would be as an expense in your P&L statement, right? Because the company is paying it. And I'm talking in the scenario of the operating lease only in this case, ठीक है? अभी हम like financial lease की बात नहीं कर रहे, ठीक है? Again, the company is not owning the asset, ठीक है? तो depreciation तो charge नहीं होगा. And in the other way, that asset won't be shown on the balance sheet. Okay. But one thing that would be shown on the balance sheet as a liability would be the outstanding amount that you have to pay, your rent outstanding or lease outstanding, because that is your liability and you have to pay it. So that is what we do in case of the company. And particularly in this case, I'm talking about the P&L statement. Okay. Talking about the operating lease, sorry. But particularly if I come back to financial lease, अगर हम financial lease के बारे में बात करें, so firstly I'll just delete all this, just erase all that basically. तो अगर हम financial lease के बारे में बात करें, so as I talked about in case of the operating lease, the ownership does not pass to the lessee or the person who is using this asset at the end of the period. But in case of financial lease, अगर कोई financial lease में आ रहा है, the ownership would pass on. The ownership would pass on. So now in this case, if you look at the owner's book, because financial lease में बोला है कि if you have taken the lease for 5 years or 6 years, at the end of 6th year, the asset would become the asset of that person who is kind of using it. तो in simple sense बोलूं, अगर मैंने किसी कंपनी को अपना asset दिया है और मैंने बोला है कि आप उसको like rent पे use कर सकते हो, so once that period is over, so I would be selling that asset at a discounted price to that person. तो अब उसमें like मेरी बुक्स में क्या होंगी adjustments? Again talking about the P&L, that period, again for that period, जब तक वो लीज खत्म नहीं हो रही एंड जब तक मैं ओनरशिप ट्रांसफर नहीं कर रहा, आई वुड बी हैविंग रेंट, ठीक है? मुझको उससे रेंट मिलता रहे, ठीक है? बिकॉज ऑब्वियसली आई एम रिसीविंग सर्टेन रेंट, ठीक है? बट अब डेप्रीसिएशन चार्ज नहीं होगा, ठीक है? एक ओनर की बुक मैंने बना दी राइट में और कंपनी की बना दी लेफ्ट में. डेप्रीसिएशन चार्ज होगा कंपनी की बैलेंस शीट में, बिकॉज इट इज अ फाइनेंशियल लीज एंड एग्रीमेंट हो गया है कि दिस एसेट वुड बी सोल्ड बाय मी. तो अभी से ही एसेट मैं दे दूंगा मैं. तो पेपर वर्क एंड एज पर द टर्म्स एंड एग्रीमेंट द ओनरशिप वुड पास ऑन at the end of 5th year, but I have given my asset. And that is the difference between the accounting treatment of the operating lease as well as financial lease. So depreciation would be charged in the company's book and asset company की बुक में शो होगा, ठीक है? जो होगा asset. Are we leaving something important? Yes, we are leaving something important. Outstanding amount. Outstanding amount would be included in company's balance sheet to the extent of the rent or the lease payment that the company is doing, and also the final amount of the whole property or the machinery that the company would pay at the end of 5 years. So outstanding account जिसमें like पूरा होगा include. Okay, so that is one thing you need to understand, ठीक है? So this was like when we talked about your operating lease and financial lease. If you again go back to it, so इसमें like सारी statements mentioned होंगी, okay? And इसमें like in most of the annual reports of the companies, that lease term is not mentioned. So it says at the date of the commencement of lease, the company recognizes the right of use of asset. So right of use of asset is almost same as lease, okay? And a corresponding lease liability for the lease arrangements in which it is a lessee. अगर lessee है वो, मतलब he is a person who is paying the rent, तो वहां पे फिर लीज लाइबिलिटी रिकॉग्नाइज हो जाएगी, ठीक है? तो योर अगर मतलब कि लीज ना लिखा हो तो इट इज सेम एज अ राइट ऑफ यूज ऑफ एसेट. एंड अगर कंपनी की बैलेंस शीट में है एसेट, इट मींस ईदर इट इज अ फाइनेंशियल लीज या कंपनी ने किसी को अपना दिया है एसेट, ठीक है? सो द टू सिनेरियोज कैन बी देयर. फिर फॉरेन करेंसी ट्रांजैक्शंस के बारे में दे मेंशन दैट व्हाट वर द फॉरेन करेंसी ट्रांजैक्शंस ऑफ द कंपनी. like with which countries they had their deals. Then provisions and contingent liabilities, and this we talked about in the previous session. What are provisions, what are reserves, and what are contingent liabilities. So as per all these sections on the basis of which, and all the tool sections like which are responsible for making the provisions for both the provisions and contingent liabilities, all that would be mentioned here. Then borrowing cost mention है company की, like कुछ borrowing costs are capitalized, तो वो as a part of the asset हो जाता है. मान लो अगर आपने लोन दिया हुआ है कि borrowing costs are directly attributable to acquisition or construction of items of property, plant, and equipment, which take substantial period of time to get ready for their intended use, are capitalized as a part of the cost of asset. मान लो if you have taken borrowings for the purpose of acquisition or construction, and that is for the purpose of capital goods, ठीक है, तो वो जो borrowing का होगा amount, that would be taken to your balance sheet. Okay. All other borrowing costs अपना statement of P&L में जाएंगी. Then financial instruments, your recognition and initial measurement, that is on what basis they recognize this. So this is like purely accounting, that your transaction cost in relation to financial assets and financial liabilities other than those carried at fair value through P&L are added to. This is all like that is like purely accounting, and financial analyst को इससे कुछ like लेना देना नहीं होता, ठीक है. But that is somewhat related to as what we talked in the previous session about comprehensive income. मान लो कुछ fair value change हो रही है asset के, and that is unrealized, and you have not sold that asset, so that would be recognized in comprehensive income. Okay, but once it is realized, like you have sold that asset, so that would be realized in your P&L because actual पैसा आ गया. Okay. Then all these classification and subsequent measurement of financial assets, how are like debt instruments recorded? Because like these are the methods for debt, kind of debt recognition. You have three methods. One is the amortized cost, one is the fair value through other comprehensive income, and one is the fair value through P&L. तो अगर यहाँ पे अगर सेल नहीं हुआ है एंड इट इज अनरियलाइज्ड, ठीक है, तो कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव इनकम में जाएगा एंड इक्विटी में रियलाइज हो जाएगा. बट अगर सेल कर दिया है तो फिर P&L में चला जाएगा, ठीक है. Then they've mentioned about the kind of equity instruments as well, because the equity instruments are measured at fair value, and fair value में कुछ change हो रहा है तो comprehensive में जाएगा and equity में adjust होगा. And अगर सेल कर दिया है तो जो भी गेन एंड लॉस करोगे उसका तुम्हारा जो भी एडजस्टमेंट होगा, सो दैट वुड बी डन इन योर P&L एंड कैश फ्लो स्टेटमेंट, ठीक है. तो आज के लिए इतना ही करते हैं. We'll continue the more sessions on reading the annual report in the subsequent sessions, and आगे फिर बात करेंगे. We'll start from your like financial liabilities, ठीक है.